lovely Ultrasaurus, expert in animal welfare science, and works on a farm, and is a partner Twitch content creator, and is a member of the Women's Guild, and is a besto friendo. It is great to have you here, Ultra. So yeah, we're gonna be chatting tonight, y'all, about some bioethics, both on the farm and in the lab. We've got several papers to go over. What is it like working on a farm?
It is hard work. So just for context for everybody, I do work on a smaller farm. A lot of my work has to do with animal husbandry, so I'm not using tractors, I'm not planting crops. I work 10.5-hour days granted, it's not even the crack of dawn right now during the wintertime in Canada. When I start work, it's pitch black, and when I finish work, it's pitch black. It's pretty awful. And yeah, it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of, you're feeding the animals, you're looking after them, you are cleaning up after them, you're constantly monitoring them. Like, hey, are you eating? Are you awake? Are you alert? Or even with our little goats, right? When we send them outside in the morning, it sounds wild, but you kind of get a feel to know the order in which they go in. And so, Skittles was in the back today when they went out. That's odd. Is Skittles doing okay? But yeah, it's very hard work. It's very rewarding, and I love working with animals. And so it's been really, really good.
The first question I wanted to ask you, and I was hoping to get both of our perspectives, is we're having this chat today on animal welfare and the bioethics behind it. But the first question someone's going to ask is, why do I care?
When I give you the answers to why I care and why I think you should care, it's probably going to be a little bit different than, Balint, why you think people should care and why anyone in chat thinks people should care. You can actually divide how people generally look at animals and how they perceive them and the importance to them by 4 separate categories. One is through the small farmer. They don't have a huge intensified farm. They work very closely with their animals, and so they have really nice close-built relationships with these animals, but they also view them on a functional production mindset. So yes, these are companions. Yes, I work with them, but they also produce and serve a purpose for me. The other one is the industrial perspective, or the intensification of agriculture, where you're running a farm, you have 1,000 cows. You're trying to make a profit. You're trying to make money. You're not looking at the individual animal. You're looking at the health of hundreds of animals at the same time. There's the science and research perspective, where you're working with animals, you're working with genes, you're working with selective breeding. You're looking at them from more of a biological, scientific perspective. And the one that resonates with me the most, and hear me out, I know it sounds silly, but it's romanticism. If you think about the art era, this is when animals started appearing in art as the focal feature. Before, they were a part of the background, they weren't really a focus. But in the romantic era for art, you start seeing emotion in animals, you start seeing them take the centerpiece, you start seeing like, wow, it's just like a deer in the background with trees and mountains, but there's no people. You don't see that in art for that. And so when you have that perspective, you view the animal as an individual, you view the animal for, it has emotions, it has feelings, and that's kind of how you perceive it. And so depending on what you relate to the most, animal welfare and why it should matter to you is a very varying different answer. There's no one end-all be-all answer other than, end of the day, it's animal welfare comes to the happiness and the health of the animal.
That is a beautiful answer. I love that very much. And so yeah, I love your 4 categories, especially the art one.
It's a cool concept. And when I say it's like, you view animals from like a romantic perspective, people go, you really love animals? It's like, no. It's the romantic era of art.
One thing that we were chatting about, the different kinds of studies to be done to account for farm animals to be comfortable, right? And to have their welfare actually maintained and managed. And Ultra, this is what your training is in. Could you tell us a little about these studies, and how does one even, like, in reading these studies about cows and chickens, I'm like, how does one even start one of these studies to account for what is important?
In providing good welfare, animals, you can give them food and water, the basics, but that doesn't make for a good life. Animals need more than that. Animals have certain needs, and they have motivation to perform certain behaviors or be in certain environments. A large part of it has to do with the basic nature of an animal, like, how social is it? What does it normally, like, if you just had it out in the wild and, it was in a forest, what have you, what are the behaviors that it would be normally performing? And then when we take this cow, when we put it on a farm or in an indoor setting, we're looking at what it's now lacking.
So it would be going from an enriching outdoor arena for, let's say, a cow, like if we just take it out from the wild, and putting it into a sterile, lacking enrichment box almost, right? And then so you'd be losing a lot of those features that the animal would be encountering normally in the wild.
Absolutely. To show motivation, you want to make the animal work for something. They have to put in energy. They have to put in effort to show you, I want this. And that's how we know an animal, like cows really like cow scratchers to scratch themselves. And chickens, they really want to be in a solitary little nesting box before they lay their eggs, or they want access to perches.
So how do you take that information and translate it to what you've built, let's say, in a farm stand or in any kind of farm setting?
Yeah, so essentially with cows, and they actually really, really like grooming implements. So you'll see often on a lot of farms, like giant brushes. Sometimes they're even mechanical and they rotate for the cows too. Gives them a nice groom, gives them a nice massage. It feels good to them and it kind of cleans them too. But how do we know that that's important? Essentially, we built a weighted gate for cows, and they had to push through this gate in order to get access to these grooming brushes. And every time we repeat this experiment, we add more and more weights to the door. Well, how much effort do you want? How badly do you want this? And cows will push a considerably very heavy gate in order to access these grooming brushes. And it's the same thing for chickens with access to perches. And before stream started, I was reading another one where they didn't use weights. They made a door smaller and smaller for chickens in order to access a nesting box before they laid their eggs. And the chickens, as the enclosure got smaller and smaller, had to try multiple times to get through. But those multiple efforts are telling us this chicken really wants to get in here. It's really important. It's exerting energy to access this area, and it's trying even though it can't get in like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, on the 6th try it gets in, and that tells us that's really important to the chicken, that it has access to this.
So it turns out honeybees, you can do something very, very similar. With bees, you can get them to solve puzzles for food that are increasing in difficulty, even to the point where they need to work together to solve the puzzle to get to the food. And they will continue to do so until you give them a weighted implement that they are unable to move. So is that at all similar, do you think, to like at least it's similar to the question that we're asking with the farm animals, but is the output something that could be similar?
Absolutely. Intellectual effort, teamwork effort is absolutely viable and comparable.
There's rules for us with mammals in the lab of what you can have them undergo, what you can treat them with that's perhaps lowering their quality of life, right? When you're testing like these original questions, how do you know when to stop?
But just in general, there are basic rules about, especially with the transportation of farm animals, there's minimum, they must have access to food for this long. They must have access to water every so many hours or so. But also it's really interesting with a lot of farm animals. Oftentimes, in order to gauge hunger and hunger reactions, you don't actually need to withhold food because of all of the selective breeding that we've done. Some of the metabolisms of animals are so enhanced that they crave and want food more than their body is actually able to handle. This is our fault. This is through selective breeding, actually. So a good example of this are broiler chickens. Broiler chickens are chickens that are raised for meat. These chickens have such high metabolisms and growth rates that their bodies actually produce muscle and mass faster than their bones and ligaments can account for it.
I'm very naive on this. I would assume that they have a lot of health issues. Is that right?
Correct.
So this was one of my questions that we Ultra had chatted about, is the ethics of this breeding, this selective breeding that we do. The idea with research, right, is that it has to be genetically identical. Otherwise, if you do tests on animal A and animal B, and they're very different for the results, then is it because there's slight genetic variation or because you did a bad experiment?
It's really interesting what you're saying, because the end goal with science is you guys are trying to get similar replicates and similar features through inbreeding, but it's a little bit different from the agricultural side. So it can be done on two different levels, but essentially with farm animals, it's called selective breeding. We can have animals that have distinct features that we want in agriculture, like grows a lot of wool, a cow that has a lot of meat, cows that produce ridiculous amounts of milk. But now with science and technology, we can actually, edit genes and actually go straight in there and start mucking about on a cellular level with these animals to get these traits that we want. And so when we talk about these broiler chickens and we talk about these traits, it's not so much inbreeding as, I'm sure they probably have a lot more variation genetically from each other than the rodents that you're talking about, but we've just chosen such extreme traits that outside of our farming practices, there's really not a lot of use to these animals. Another good example of this is sheep. A lot of people don't know this, but the sheep that we have on farms, they need us, because their wool will just keep growing and growing and growing. And you get situations where, I think somewhere it was like in New Zealand or Australia, some sheep got loose for a year or two and came back, was completely emaciated, had like 100 and something, 200 pounds of wool on it. Unless we shear these sheep every year, like they literally cannot survive without us now, because we've selected for a trait that nature wouldn't normally, like this wouldn't happen in the wild. We've done this for agriculture.
And that's similar too in the lab. Like we've done a bunch of selection with the mice or even the fruit flies, like, and everything in between, where there's other things that have gone wrong where they wouldn't survive in the wild. Like my least favorite example is there was a study where researchers we identified this new gene for learning and memory in the mouse. How amazing is this? Turned out the mouse was actually deaf. And that's where the mutation had actually come from and what was affecting. So there was other mutations in there, and that mouse wouldn't have survived the wild because it was deaf. Right? Or there were also lost fear responses. There was also blind animals in the lab that now couldn't see. So you're doing this inbreeding for these certain features. It makes it really hard. Again, excuse the naivete, but does that come with an increase in healthcare costs for the animals because of what we've bred into them?
Yes and no. I think a lot of these facilities, these farmers are aware of the health issues. They're aware of the dichotomy of, I have an animal that produces this much stuff or grows this quickly, while also knowing that it causes these side effects. And so on the surface level, it doesn't look great, but if you're actually working on these farms, working with these animals, you know about the health problems that they're having. Certain measures are done to try to make things better for them. So with the broiler chickens, right, another benefit to only, this sounds really bad, but another benefit to not letting them live past a certain age is, the bigger they get, the more likely they are to have those bone problems and ligament problems. And so when we take them at that specific age and size, it's kind of a happy medium where we're not letting them get to that size where, no, this is definitely a problem with the majority of the chickens in our flock now. That
sounds similar to the research side of things as well, where that at a certain point, if you were to allow the disease progression, let's say, of a tumor model to continue, the end result, it's past the point of no return. And instead of having the animal survive for a month or two more, and you're just kind of stretching it out, it's you just end it at that point because the experiment is done. So it's almost, while you said, it might seem from the distance of oh, why are you doing that? But it's for the long-term welfare of the animal. It's the much more humane thing to do. Like you were mentioning, we had selective breeding that we could do over the course of hundreds of years, and now we have these broiler chickens. I got to read up on these. This is just so cool. But now you mentioned too, we can just take them into the lab and edit them, right? So what considerations, I guess, go into play on your side of things if we started doing that? And then on our side of things in the lab, if we started doing that, I wonder if there are different ethical considerations to take into account.
I think I personally don't have a problem with gene editing. I mean, we're already, using gene editing with a lot of chickens and a lot of our agriculture. And so I think if it's done ethically and we do our science, we do our research, we really examine things. We're not just shooting things out because it looks good on paper. I personally don't have a problem with it. I mean, essentially, you're doing the same thing that we've been doing for hundreds of of years with selective breeding. It's just on a more specific microscopic level, right? To me, there's not that much of a difference. It's just you speed up the process.
Yeah. I guess, like, I like how you said instead of just shooting from the hip, of like in some kind of educated manner, and maybe that's what you can take from the lab side of things, of like, we know if we alter this gene, X happens. And then now that's the information that we use to take into the livestock of like, all right, this is going to increase muscle growth, or this is going to increase lactation production, versus just like, hey, let's just shoot stuff from the hip. Also, I mean, price does come into play too. It's really difficult to do with something that would be on the really like large side of things versus something that's on the small side of things. Ultra, please plug anything that you'd like right now, like whatever is upcoming for the party people.
Like Farm Sim, that's kind of what we're doing right now. And while we're playing Farm Sim, I talk about a lot of these animal issues and how farming works and the biology behind farming a little bit too. We just like to have a chill, cozy time and vibe and hang out. And we love talking about science, and we particularly love SciAnts and what you do here with science outreach. I think it's really, really important, and I'm just having a really good time. I love having these conversations, and I truly felt like at TwitchCon, I did not spend enough time talking to you.
Incredible creator, and I love her takes recently while playing Farm Sim, because she's actually like a real life farmer, so she could be like evaluating how good the sim is and sneaking in like, here, y'all, we're gonna play a game, but I'm gonna teach you about all of this. And it's just, I love that about your stream. Even the you play the supermarket simulator.
Yes.
And you were telling us about supply and demand and comparing it to like what happens like on the farm. And I was just like, see, this is my kind of people. You're just sneaking in these little facts about like how to like teach me when they're behind the game. And I really, really, really love that's what was going down. And like that's like you're sneaking in those educational questions, and people can ask questions too, and it's just such a welcoming and cool environment.